You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for May 3rd, 2019. This week, I'm going to talk cycling to work, non-STEMI, niacin, cardiologist pay, and end-of-life discussions when prognosis is short. I want to first say thanks to the leaders of the Portuguese Cardiac Society for asking me to speak at their annual meeting. There were about 3,000 attendees there, and it was an incredible meeting. It was my first trip to Portugal, and I found it to be a beautiful country full up with beautiful people. My driver, Walter, told me that being warm and helpful were characteristics of the Portuguese people, and indeed, my short experience in this enthralling country confirmed his claim. And to those of you who came up to me and say that you listen to the podcast, you should know that this means a lot to me. I often speak into a microphone and I really never know who is listening, so thank you. First topic is cycling to work. I decided a few years ago that I would bike to work. I live close to my hospital, I only go to one hospital, and my kids are grown and no longer need me to be their taxi driver. And despite living in a very bike-unfriendly, car-centered city, I love bike commuting. My favorite is riding home in the dark after a long day. Even when you're dead tired, within a few pedal strokes, you start to feel better. And there have been numerous observational studies showing that biking to work associates with health. Liam Davenport, a journalist from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, nicely covered another one of these papers. This one was presented at the Euro Conference on Obesity in Glasgow. The research team found that obese individuals who actively commute to and from work, particularly those who cycle, may be able to reduce their risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular events versus those who go to work by car. And they conclude their observational study by saying, quote, "Our findings, if causal, suggest that those who are overweight or obese could potentially attenuate that risk of all-cause mortality if they engage in active commuting." Now, okay, let's just make this a simple one. It is almost certainly not causal. People who bike to work may do better for many reasons. They have more money to buy a bike. They have a job that allows biking to work. They live in a community that is safe to ride a bike or walk. Now, I don't want my critique of this study to sound personal, but observational studies like this are probably just not needed. I mean, studying biking to work is a little like studying the health effects of being rich. Of course it is a good thing. Now, we don't require flawed observational studies to confirm the benefits of being rich enough or blessed enough to ride your bike to work. I'm currently working on a column now on the many downsides of observational studies, and I worry that observational studies, even when they're enhanced by robust statistical techniques, are just simply too flawed by selection bias to be helpful. Second topic. Here's the scenario. You ready? A patient presents with angina, nonspecific T-wave changes, mild troponins, and you make the diagnosis of non-STEMI. You go for the early invasive strategy, but at cath you find multiple lesions. Now what? Which one do you do? Unlike in STEMI, identifying the infarct-related artery in patients with non-STEMI is tricky. That's because patients like this one may have multiple lesions, or they may even have non-ischemic reasons like myocarditis. Obviously, knowing the infarct-related artery is important, so a group of researchers from New York, Durham, and Maastricht undertook a small but really interesting study of patients with STEMI. They had 118 patients that they did delayed enhanced MRI before the angiogram. Then they let the interventional cardiologist do their thing, blinded to the results of the MRI. Now, of course, the novelty of this is that the MRI can tell which area of the heart is affected. The findings were that about 2/3 of the patient, the infarct-related artery was identified on cath, and 1/3 of patients, the infarct-related artery could not be identified. And in the group that the doc thought they had the right artery, the MRI found a different infarct-related territory in 14% and a non-ischemic diagnosis in 13%. In the 1/3, the group where they could not identify an infarct-related artery, MRI found a focal MI in many cases, but also noted non-ischemic origin in 8 of these 42 patients. But these are not the best results. The best result is this. 1 in 4 patients who had revascularization had PCI solely to the non-culprit territory as determined by MRI. In 11 of those 15, the infarct was in another territory, and in 4 of the 15, the diagnosis was not coronary artery disease, but myocarditis or Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. I highlight this study because I think it's novel and sobering. Of course, we're not going to use this data to start ordering delayed enhanced MRI before angiography in patients with non-STEMI, but this should inform clinical and interventional cardiologists that we may be getting the wrong diagnosis often, and this includes putting stents in the wrong vessel. Patrice Wendling has a great news story on this topic. She got quotes from Deepak Bhatt, and I agree with what he said. He commented that these findings could inform a future RCT looking at an MRI-guided intervention in patients with STEMI. Third topic today is niacin. Now, the first thing to say about this topic is that in medicine, it's useful to know what does not work. JAMA Network Open published a systematic review and meta-analysis on the evidence underpinning FDA-approved uses of niacin, and this study included 119 trials with more than 35,000 patients. And the bottom line is that they found no preventive association of niacin with cardiovascular outcomes in secondary prevention. It was negative on death, cardiovascular death, stroke, and combined MACE. They also did a meta-regression looking at changes in LDL compared with log risk ratios of outcomes and found no relationship of rising HDL to any outcome. One positive note is that they did identify 2 studies that were done in the 1970s and 80s that addressed niacins without statins, monotherapy. And these 2 trials taken together found the 25% relative risk reduction that did meet statistical significance. The authors say that this analysis is the first systematic review that quantifies the number of trials performed on niacin's association with CVD prevention, and that they found that most of these relied on surrogate measures and only 3 trials provided high-quality evidence. And compared with other meta-analyses of niacin, this was also the first that investigated the strength of the evidence behind the FDA-approved indications for niacin as monotherapy, and they found that these trials were insufficient and not generalizable. Of course, that's because they were done in the 1970s and 80s. Now, though the inefficacy of niacin has been confirmed in the AIM-HIGH and HSP2 THRIVE trials, this meta-analysis is worth noting for 3 reasons. 1, niacin was approved, remember, on surrogate measures. Then outcomes proved it ineffective. Now, this is a good historical lesson, and it backs up the case for being a medical conservative, as medical conservatives adopt therapy only when the evidence is strong. This review also notes that the evidence for niacin as monotherapy comes from studies before the internet and are likely not generalizable to today's care. Third, though this is a great paper, I do disagree with the author's last line when they call for more research. I would argue that spending more dollars on niacin is wasteful and we should just close this chapter. Next topic is cardiologist pay. The Medscape Physicians Compensation Report this year reveals that cardiologist pay ranks among the top in all of medicine. And it's slightly higher really than it was last year. The average cardiologist pay is $423,000 per year. This was a big sample size too. This was 19,000 respondents to this Medscape report. Some other notable findings were that almost 90% of survey respondents reported being very satisfied or satisfied with their job performance. About half feel that they're fairly compensated. But get this, more than 80% would choose medicine again, and I found that a remarkable finding given all of the press about burnout. Now, I suspect that cardiologists feel undercompensated because of one main reason, and that is night call. Cardiology work is fun, rewarding, but it is super hard, especially for the interventional cardiologist who comes in all hours to do acute PCI for STEMI. This seems like fun when you're in your 30s, but I see my 50-year-old colleagues doing it, and it's hard work. Now, my personal take on the absolute salary levels is that it is a lot of money, a really lot of money. I chose EP, and even after 2 decades of doing it, I really love EP now as much as I did when I started. And don't tell anybody this, but I'd probably work for less money. And at the risk of sounding old and a bit trite, the best decision I ever made when I was a young cardiologist was to listen to my wife, Stacy. Stacy comes from Indiana, Hoosiers, and she insisted that we pay off our debts as quick as possible and that we live far, far below our means so that we could save money. And that strategy paid dividends now. Final topic today is having the prognosis discussion with patients. Medscape recently did a short poll to assess clinicians' comfort with end-of-life discussions with older patients who have chronic illnesses. Less than half of the docs and APCs on the report always or frequently have these discussions. Young clinicians have these discussions less often than older physicians. And more, this is a crucial topic for two big reasons. One is that patients increasingly live with more and more comorbidities. The second force that's making this a crucial topic is that medical technology allows us to do even more interventions, which can sometimes be miraculous, yes, for sure, but also sometimes can extend the period of suffering at end of life. The reason Medscape got interested in doing this poll were two articles on the topic. One was in the Annals of Family Medicine, and that was on the patient perspective, and the other was in JAMA Internal Medicine from more of a clinician's point of view. The Family Medicine paper was a survey of almost 900 older adults who were asked to consider a hypothetical patient with a limited life expectancy. The researchers asked the older adults whether they would like to talk with their doc about how long they may live, whether it was acceptable for the doc to even offer this discussion, or whether they wanted to discuss life expectancy with their family. And the results of this survey really help explain some of the challenges of having these conversations. Get this, almost 60% of these older adults did not want to discuss how long they might live in the presented scenario. And within this group, most did not think that the doctor should even offer the discussion, and nearly 90% did not want the doctor to discuss life expectancy with their family or friends. Slightly more than half of these older adults wanted to discuss life expectancy only if it was less than 2 years. Now, the second paper from JAMA Internal Medicine came from two docs at Harvard, and it was an editorial titled, quote, "Softening Our Approach to Discussing Prognosis." And their main argument was that we should pair our hopes and worries together in these conversations, and we should use the pronoun I. As in, I hope you have a long time to live, but I worry that time may be short. I statements, the authors write, acknowledges that the viewpoint expressed in these conversations is personal. They contrast this with you statements, which focuses on the person being spoken to. Like this, you could live for as short as a few years with your heart disease. Now, this method that they put out also allows a clinician to express uncertainty in prognosis, which is really important. And yet another advantage of their method is that it promotes a connection and partnership with patients rather than this tug of war. Now, I highlight this topic because for clinicians today and the clinicians of tomorrow, end-of-life care will be our greatest healthcare crisis. Lifespan, if you look at the CDC, has really not increased much in the past 20 years. Death from heart disease and cancer have mostly plateaued, but what hasn't plateaued is the rise in deaths from frailty and dementia-related illnesses. And indeed, this confirms what I see every day in the hospital. The struggle in cardiology is not whether we can intervene, but whether we should intervene. Will we help someone with our intervention, or will we just extend their suffering? This is the question that comes up so often. And this isn't just a clinical issue. The Family Medicine paper aligns really with Ivan Illich's cultural iatrogenesis. Illich argued that the more healthcare pervades our culture, the less capable we, patients and clinicians alike, will become with the normal arc of life and death. So that's it for this week in cardiology. An announcement before I close. Next week is the Heart Rhythm Society meeting in San Francisco. This is the biggest meeting for electrophysiologists. I'll be attending. Next week's podcast will include probably a few topics from that meeting, as well as some other review. So as always, I'm grateful that you listened, and thank you. And remember, if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a review, 5 stars. That way other people can find us. Until next week, This is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
Want to know what cardiologists are earning across the country? Wonder how other physicians feel about their personal job performance and career satisfaction? Get all this and more from Medscape's 2019 Physician Salary Report, now available with specialty-specific insight. To find it, go to www.medscape.com/compensation 2019. Again, that's www.medscape.com/compensation 2019. Don't miss the Physician Salary Report.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.